Today we are going to talk about the borough of Queens and the Portuguese-born princess, later Queen of England, Catarina of Bragança, after whom the borough was named. The borough of Queens, the largest of New York City, covers 118.6 square miles in the western portion of Long Island, or 37.2% of the city's total area. It is bounded by Brooklyn on the west, by the East River on the north, by the Atlantic Ocean on the south, and by Nassau County on the east. It is home to 1,891,325 people. It is the second largest borough in population, superseded only by Brooklyn. It is largely residential with more than 300,000 one- and two-family houses, as well as apartment towers of various heights. It has attractive neighborhoods, such as Douglaston, Forest Hills, and Kew Gardens, as well as slums in Jamaica and in the Rockaways. Industrial areas exist close to Long Island City and Maspeth. The most important commercial centers are located in Astoria, Corona, Flushing, Jackson Heights, and Jamaica. Queens has the highest median income of any borough, and in the late 1970s, a 92% rate of employment. 6,474 acres of parkland, 2 racetracks, 2 major tennis centers, several golf courses, and a wildlife refuge are some of the amenities to be found in this borough. Several cemeteries are spread out on what was once a rural and agricultural land. The Steinway Piano Factory and the Edward Smith and Company Paint Factory established plants in Queens during the 19th century. The beaches of the north and south shore of Long Island attract a large number of summer residents. In 1910, the Queensboro Bridge and the East River Tunnel of the Pennsylvania Railroad allowed direct access to Manhattan. Over the next decades, the subways provided transportation, and the construction of the Triborough Bridge in 1936, the Bronx-Whitestone Bridge and the Queens Midtown Tunnel in 1939, and the Throgs Neck Bridge in 1961 made Queens readily accessible by car. In 1939, the first of 2 World's Fairs was held in Flushing Meadows, coinciding with the development of LaGuardia Airport. The first inhabitants of Queens were the Rockaway Indians, and the first settlers were the Dutch, who arrived around 1635. French and English immigrants followed, and while the Dutch preferred the western part of Long Island, the English colonized the eastern portion, including the towns of Hempstead and Jamaica. In 1683, 19 years after the British took title to the former Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, these towns were organized as Queens County, one of 12 making up the British province of New York. During the American Revolution, most residents of Queens were British sympathizers, and after the war, many emigrated to Newfoundland. The name Queens County honors the Portuguese-born princess Catarina of Bragança, wife of Charles II of England. 1988 commemorates the 350th anniversary of her birth. Claire Schulman, the president of the Borough of Queens, will issue a proclamation marking the event on June the 21st, 1988. There will be a celebration at the Queens Festival to be held in Flushing Meadows Park in June, exhibitions and programs at Queens College and at the Queens Museum. The American Portuguese Society is organizing a black tie dinner to be held in June 1988. Who was Catarina of Bragança? She was the daughter of King John IV of Portugal and of that strong-willed Spanish princess, Luisa de Guzman. She was born in the palace at Villa Viçosa in Portugal, the king's only daughter. It was during the reign of John IV that Portugal achieved independence from the tight rule of Spain, who had dominated the country for a few decades. Why was Catarina of Bragança chosen to be the Queen of Charles II of England? Let us go back in time to the England of the 1700s. To Charles, the first Stuart monarch of that name, and his French wife Henrietta Maria, was born an heir. The Prince Charles II was born May 29, 1630. A later description, after the Battle of Worcester, when Charles was in his early 20s, tells us that he was 2 yards high, with a dark, swarthy complexion. given to him probably by the Italian side of his family. Marie de' Medici was his grandmother. Trained by his French Catholic mother, Charles showed a wonderful civility, an insinuating manner, and gracious charm. The Bishop of Chichester, with a kind and gentle manner, took part in Charles' education and greatly influenced his pupil. However, Charles' education was deficient. Not only in scholastic learning, he hated writing. His Latin was deficient, as well as his French. But he also lacked self-control, mental and physical discipline, partly due to the ineptitude and laxity of some of his guardians. At age 15, he was separated from his father and became a refugee in France. There, his two closest friends, the dissolute Duke of Buckingham and Lord Perry, had great influence, not always the best, on an idle, bored prince. Money was always a problem with Charles, since his younger days, when after the regal splendor of his birth was followed by a separation from his father, and his flight to the farther limits of his father's dominions. His mother, Henriette Marie, a penniless refugee, lived at the French court and received a meager stipend. One particular hard winter, she and her small daughter were obliged to remain all day in bed, not possessing the means to buy a fagot to light a fire. Like most mothers in the same circumstances, she tried to marry her son to a wealthy woman. A French woman was considered at first, Mademoiselle de Montpensier, la grande demoiselle. But Charles, a young, growing boy, was more interested in Mademoiselle de Montpensier's lavish table than on her charms. In September of 1648, on his return to England, Charles landed at Jersey with less than 5 shillings in his pocket. In 1651, virtually a prisoner of the Scotch Covenanters, a group of ferocious fanatics, Charles was crowned king at Scone. After their defeat at Worcester at the hands of Cromwell, Charles was left wandering for weeks with his life in his hand. When once more he returned to France, he was so destitute of even decent clothes that the governor of the town in which the English party landed regarding him as a disreputable person. His mother had not enough money to buy him a shirt, and he had to live entirely on the generosity of the Cardinal de Retz. His companions complained they could not afford to buy postage for their correspondence. Charles had to share a meager allowance of 60,000 livres a month offered by the French court with his mother and her favorite, Lord Jermyn. Upon his return, he took up again with Mademoiselle de Montpensier, but Mazarin vetoed the marriage, refusing to let the de Montpensier fortune leave France. The young prince was left a pawn in the Italians' hands. His followers began to fear that Mazarin wanted to hand Charles to Cromwell and insisted on having him removed from France. Finally, Mazarin agreed at a great cost to lend him the money for the journey. Over the next 4.5 years, Charles was kept wandering in Germany and Flanders, poorly lodged and in dire financial circumstances. He had to sell his horses to pay for his keep and had to borrow from friends. In 1656, Charles negotiated a treaty with the Spanish minister, offering him the transfer of the Irish regiments from the service of France to that of Spain, in exchange for immediate financial relief and future military and political assistance to regain his throne from Cromwell. As the Spanish delayed the promised payment, the king and his household fell into abject poverty. The soldiers of the Irish regiment in Spanish pay, which they never received, wandered about the streets, hungry and half naked. After Cromwell's death, Charles issued a declaration of Breda, granting liberty of conscience to all his subjects who abided by the law. This declaration contributed to the peaceful restoration of the monarchy in England. On May 23, 1660, Charles set sail for his native land after an exile of 15 years. The country, exhausted by the heavy expenditures of Cromwell on the army and navy, which kept him in power, lay on the verge of bankruptcy. No wonder that there were those who tried to have the King of England find a wealthy woman to become their queen. There were also political considerations. Henriette Marie, the Queen's sister, was married to Philippe, Duke of Orleans, the brother to Louis XIV, King of France. It was important to find a wife for Charles, agreeable to the government of France. A marriage with a Protestant princess would have been popular with the Parliament and the people of Great Britain, but a difficulty existed in finding a suitable lady. Charles disliked German women. "Oddfish, they are all foggy," he once exclaimed. The court of Spain, anxious over the match, offered to treat the Princess of Parma as daughters of Spain and offered them a dowry. However, Charles considered them ugly. The French court suggested Dona Catarina of Bragança, the daughter of John IV of Portugal. Her dowry, the largest recorded at the time, consisted of 2 millions of cruzados, more than 800,000 pounds sterling, the city of Tangiers on the North African coast, and the city of Bombay in India. Tangiers would give England a commanding place of vantage in the Mediterranean, and the city of Bombay in India afforded the opportunity of obtaining control of the East Indian trade. Not a small matter to a nation attached to commercial pursuits. This English trait was noticed by Charles, and on one occasion he wrote to his beloved sister, "The thing which is nearest the heart of the nation is trade, and all that belongs to it." The Treaty of Marriage was signed on the 23rd day of June, 1661. Catarina, 9 years younger than the king, was described as low in stature, prettily shaped, languishing and excellent eyes, her teeth wronging her mouth by sticking a little too far out. Yet, when she arrived with her Iberian dress, a stiff farthingale with white skirts, in an alien hairstyle, described as the foretop long and turned aside very strangely, the king is said to have exclaimed to his companion, "George, they have brought me a bat, not a woman." In time, she took to wearing only English-style clothes and changed her hairstyle as well. The court of Charles II was far removed in geography and mores from a native Villa Viçosa. Charles' court has been named dissolute and free living, and the king's sensual indulgence is well acknowledged. It has been attributed the orgy of immorality that accompanied the Restoration period in England to a natural reaction from the unnatural social conditions and hypocrisy prevalent during the Puritan domination. Drunkenness and disorderly living among the lower classes was noted. The middle and higher classes frequented the theaters and often led dissolute lives. Of the king's many faults, one was indolence. "I will not deny that naturally I am more lazy than I ought to be," he wrote one occasion to his sister Henriette, Minette, as he affectionately called her. However, the king had no affectation and was blessed with natural good humor. Here is a description of his court on a gambling night given by a visitor. "I shall never forget the inexpressible luxury, profaneness, gaming, and all dissoluteness. I was witness of the king sitting and toying with his concubines, a French boy singing love songs in that glorious gallery, while about 20 of the great courtiers and other dissolute persons were at basset round a large table, a bank of at least 2,000 pounds in gold before them." This was the court that convent-educated Catarina entered at age 24. Upon her arrival in Portsmouth, she insisted on a Catholic marriage ceremony, in addition to the Protestant one already planned. The king agreed, but kept the ceremony a secret. The king's many mistresses caused Catarina a great deal of pain. When she arrived in England, the king's mistress, Barbara de Villiers, later made Countess of Castlemaine, was expecting their second child, fathered by the king. Catarina was expected to accept the status quo, and Charles wanted Barbara to become one of the queen's attendants. He presented her with a list of the ladies for a chamber. His mistress' name, Countess of Castlemaine, was on top of the list. Catarina angrily crossed it out. When the king introduced her to the countess, she recognized the dreaded name and fell back in a chair with blood pouring from her nostrils. Then she fainted. She threatened to go back to Lisbon. Quarrels followed. The king sent Lord Clarendon to make her more amenable. Catarina's dowry, which had been promised to be paid in silver crowns by her mother, was in fact paid in cargoes of sugar from Brazil, spices from the Orient, and bills of exchange. As no immediate cash could be raised, she was criticized. The king's finances were tight. His mistress, Countess of Castlemaine, often lost large sums at gambling, and the queen was forced to send back to Lisbon a retinue of more than 100 persons. She was only allowed to keep half a dozen people. When the queen failed to become pregnant, it was suggested that she take the water at Turnbridge Wells. She was expected to pay the removal of a court because the king had no money. It was reported at one time that his stockings had holes and that he had only 6 handkerchiefs. The king's bastard son, James Croft, was made Duke of Monmouth, which meant that the king was publicly acknowledging him as his son. Not surprisingly, patience seems to have been one of Queen Catarina's great virtues. One occasion, she was criticized for taking so long at a dressing table. She replied, "I have so much reason to use patience that I can very well bear with it." In her quest to give Charles an heir, she took the waters at Bath. In the morning of her return trip to London, she miscarried. Eventually, she recovered. One morning, coming from Mass, she was a devout woman, she entered a bedchamber without knocking. Near the bed, she saw Francis Stuart, another of her attendants, and the king. Francis would become still another of his mistresses. In a court where illicit relations flourished, she was monogamous. Men tried to elicit from her favors as a stepping stone to their success at court. Such was the case with Edward, Lord Montague, who had brought her from Lisbon. Lord Montague was a drinker at her tea parties. Her tea parties were a peculiarity of a court. In an age when tea was usually taken by prescription only, it was quite expensive, 2 guineas a pound. While the king was keeping his mistresses and begetting children all along, he was jealous of Catarina's admirers. Lord Montague was promptly removed from the court. Time went by. Conflict occurred between the Dutch and the English merchants. Captain Holmes, who had been sent to reduce the Dutch settlements on the West African coast, took New Amsterdam, renaming it New York. Charles wrote to his mother, "It is a place of great importance to trade. It belonged to England heretofore, but the Dutch by degrees drove our people out and built a very good town. But we have got the better of it, and 'tis now called New York." The plague hit London, and Catarina and Charles were removed to Oxford. There the Queen announced that she was again with child. Soon afterwards she miscarried once more. At the same time, Charles' mistress Barbara had another son by the king. One day Catarina, still ill, told Barbara, "I fear the king takes cold by staying too late at your lodging." Barbara replied, "He leaves me early enough. He must stay with somebody else." The king overheard this and called Barbara bold and impertinent, and he sent his mistress away from the court. The great fire engulfed London. People were saying that Catholics had set it. Plots were set. The king was to divorce Catarina. In 1665, when she lay ill, a plot was formulated to have Francis Stuart marry the king. On another occasion, the Lord of Bristol sent spies to Portugal to confirm that she was indeed barren. Even her own confessor tried to have her sent to a convent. She said she had no vocation for the religious life. Lord Buckingham proposed a fancy scheme of kidnapping her and shipping her to a plantation in America. Charles' infatuation with Francis Stuart slowly came to an end when he found her in bed with her cousin, the Duke of Richmond. Francis, appalled by the king's violent reaction, came to Catarina for help. Catarina suggested a hasty marriage to Lord Richmond. As the king became older, he preferred the company of younger women. Mary Knight the singer, Molly Davis the dancer, Nell Gwynn were some who attracted his fancy. Another miscarriage, and a perfectly formed child this time, convinced Charles that Catarina could indeed bear children. She was older now, more mature, different from the convent-bred young Portuguese girl that had arrived at Portsmouth. Her hair was parted in the middle, and she had grown plump. She had learned to dance, as the king was a good dancer. She loved music, and is credited with introducing the first Italian opera to England. Charles had a son by his current mistress, Nell Gwynn, and installed her on a house with a garden overlooking the mall. His mother died. Henrietta, the king's sister, whom he adored and called Minette, came to visit with him in England. In the French entourage came a girl, Louise de Quirwall. The king insisted that she stay in England. He later enacted a mock marriage with her. She gave birth to a child 9 months later. Later on, Louise de Quirwall was displaced by Hortense Mancini, Cardinal Mazarin's niece. Catarina retired to Somerset House. A plot broke out. The king was going to be murdered, and by 2 Catholic priests. The Duke of York was to replace the king. Charles questioned Catarina whether she knew of any Catholic activity against the state or the Church of England. She denied any knowledge. People were being murdered. Some Catholics fled the country. Charles was afraid for Catarina and wanted her to come back to Whitehall. Tension was in the air, and the Bishop of London was hounding Catholics. Parliament voted a bill to exclude James, the king's brother, who was a Catholic, from the succession. The House of Lords rejected the bill. A bill of divorce was proposed so that Charles could marry a Protestant consort. Catarina was accused of having participated in a plot to murder the king and was charged with high treason. Charles had her accuser immediately arrested, but public and parliamentary clamor was terrific. Catarina thought they would bring her to the block and sent a letter to her brother Pedro asking for his protection. When the news was spread in Lisbon, the Portuguese were enraged, and the English who lived in the city feared for their lives. Some of the Queen's priests were charged with the murder of a Protestant magistrate. Catholic lords were imprisoned in the Tower, and even a physician, Wakeman, was implicated. Charles took Catarina away to Windsor and stood by her side. In November, on Queen Elizabeth's Day, Protestants organized the annual Pope burning, but this time on an enlarged scale. Books and pamphlets incited the citizens to beware of troops of papists who were ravishing their wives and daughters. Both Catarina and Charles were ill with chills and fever. Charles had the parliament dissolved. The Protestants wanted the king to name his bastard son Monmouth as his successor, but the king refused to deprive his brother of his legal right. 3 years passed. The Queen's 46th birthday was celebrated with the grandest display anyone remembered since the Restoration. She led the dancing in the banqueting hall, and there was a display of fireworks on the Thames. England was prosperous. Catarina's marriage had given Great Britain control of the East Indian trade. Commerce in furniture, textiles, tea was carried on with the distant corners of the globe. The city of Bombay brought by Catarina's dowry, had started the British Empire in India. The city merchants set up a statue to Charles in their new, enlarged exchange. The king's bastard son Monmouth became involved in a republican plot against his father. Catarina pleaded with them for a reconciliation. Monmouth died at the executioner's axe only a few months after his father's death. The king became ill, possibly with a stroke. On his deathbed, Catarina asked him to pardon her for whatever wrong she had done him. He replied, "Poor woman, she begged my pardon. I beg hers with all my heart." Madame Louise de Kerouac, one of the king's mistresses and maid of honor to Catarina, lived at the palace in great splendor. Her quarters were far more luxurious than the queen's own quarters, and her insolence to the queen often noted. A love of jewels cost the king dearly. Madame Louise saw the king was dying and reminded his brother that the king was a Catholic at heart and should confess to a Catholic priest to save his soul. The king agreed, and the Count of Castelmelhor, one of the queen's Portuguese courtiers, suggested Huddleston, who had saved the king's life after the Battle of Worcester. Later on, all of the king's bastards were brought into the room, except Monmouth. He recommended them to his brother, as well as his mistresses. He died at noon, in the 55th year of his age. He had left 50 natural children. Catarina made her plans to return to her beloved Portugal. Years earlier, when she was ill after one of her miscarriages, she had told Charles, "When I am dead, I wish that my body be taken to lie with my ancestors in Portugal." She had also stressed the need for continuous understanding between Portugal and England, and she asked the king for the continuation of English protection to the Portuguese people. However, a return was delayed for a variety of reasons. She remained in England for a few more years and was present at the controversial birth of James II's son. She acted as the child's godmother. William of Orange became King of England, and James II found refuge in France. The attack on the Catholics became virulent. The new king's wife, a petty woman, niece of Catarina, did not like her aunt and forced her to leave her house. She found refuge at Hammersmith and spent her time amongst the nuns in a convent she had founded there. Her station in life had lowered considerably, and after a few more years she was ready to sail back to Portugal. However, William of Orange's parsimony delayed the funds that she was entitled to by a marriage contract. Furthermore, her brother-in-law James thought that a presence in England was necessary as means to helping him regain the English throne. The King of France supported James, and Catarina, eager to return to Portugal, was prevented from doing so. Finally, James' abortive effort in Ireland to reclaim his lost crown brought relief to Catarina. She had been a widow for 7 years before she could return to her native land. On a journey back to Portugal, she refused to go to Versailles, where the King of France wanted to entertain her, and preferred to travel incognito through France. Upon arrival in Spain, she was received with great pomp by the comitive sent by her brother Pedro. On January 20th, she arrived in Lisbon and was met by the brother she had not seen in 30 years. For years there were many festivities in her honor. Her English clothes now shocked the Portuguese, as her Portuguese clothes had once shocked her husband's subjects. Catarina liked to travel about the country, and the Portuguese found this curious. In February 1699, she visited Vila Viçosa, the place of her birth, and on May the 4th, she proceeded to Évora, where she was very well received. She built herself a palace at Bemposta and lived there until her death. Over the great door one may still see the arms of England cut in stone. On 1705, she was declared Queen Regent of Portugal, as her brother was seriously ill. The country was at war with Philippe of Anjou, the French claimant to the throne of Spain. Catarina pursued the war with skill, and the armies of Portugal were victorious. It was during her regency that Portugal signed the Treaty of Methuen with England. This treaty, some claim, greatly favored England. It fostered the industry of port wine, but it destroyed a budding Portuguese textile industry. She became ill and passed away December 31st, 1705, quite peacefully. She is buried at the Church of Belém, near Lisbon. 1 hour before her death, she had told the doctor that in England she had been falsely accused of an endeavor to bring in the popery, that she had never been a promoter of French interests, and that she was grieved to think the French fashion in her brother's court would do England ill offices in Portugal. She was 67 years old. John Evelyn wrote, "She deported herself so decently upon all occasions, which made her universally beloved."